Turn us on if you want to see us. Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube. Make it plain. We are headed to Memphis to commemorate, recognize the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., to recognize his martyrdom. I still feel funny about saying an anniversary of an assassination or an anniversary of someone's death. That's a little awkward for me. But and so I prefer to talk about his martyrdom. If anything is to be celebrated, it is his martyrdom. And along with martyrdom comes redemption. Speaking of sin, he died for the sins of America, Dr. King did. And bullets were the nails in his cross. That's why the bullets that are killing our young people are so painful and unacceptable to bear, considering what he talked about: little black children, little white children, hand in hand, not little black children and little white children being shot. 50 years ago, Memphis, Tennessee, trying to stand up for people who pick up the trash. Most of us don't even speak to or acknowledge the people who pick up our rubbish. And so it says a lot about us when we don't acknowledge that what he was doing was something on behalf of lowly sanitation workers. Joining us now, there's several new books out, a lot of conversations out now, a lot of new things being looked at with regards to this anniversary, this commemoration, this 50 years hence. Joining us now with his new book entitled Redemption, Martin Luther King Jr.'s Last 31 Hours. Joining us now is an award-winning journalist who's been with the Boston Globe and Frontline, senior editor for Inc. magazine. He's written for the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, American Prospect. Joseph Rosenbloom is with us now. Joe, good morning. How are you, sir?
Good morning.
Pleasure to have you. Is it my understanding that you were living in Memphis or an intern with the Commercial Appeal in 1968?
Yeah, that's right. I was an intern in the summer of 1968 at the Morning Daily, the Memphis Commercial Appeal.
Yes. And so this was after the assassination, I take it.
That's right.
So what was that like getting there in the summer? I guess there was still, was it still sort of a fog in the air around that? Was there enough going on there or something going on there that piqued your interest even coming in the summer?
Yeah, there was. There was even then, I think a feeling of shock and dismay at what had happened in just a few months before in the murder of Dr. King. And so I was just a lowly intern, but there was downtime when we'd be sitting around and the other reporters would be telling their stories about covering the events that surrounded Dr. King when he was in Memphis. And so I heard those stories, and I was intrigued by those stories. And I thought that someday I'd like to revisit the subject.
In listening to those stories, what kind of stood out for you? Was there anything that stood out to you that was particularly dramatic or extraordinary?
Well, it's been a long time. I don't remember a lot of the drift of the stories, but when reporters talk about things like that, they talk about what happened with them and what they covered. There was the actual night of the assassination. The reporters were scurrying around, trying to get into the hospital to find out what happened. So there was one reporter who had to pretend that he was a patient so he could get past the security and get in the hospital. And it's that kind of story they told. There was one story about a call that came in over the not a call, but a broadcast over the police scanner,
Mm-hmm.
and they said the doctor that this is just after he was pronounced dead. Dr. King was pronounced dead at 7:05 p.m. So over the police scanner it says Dr. King is dead, and so there was one of the business reporters who said, "Oh my God, why Memphis?" So I mean, people were shocked, and people were especially shocked that it had happened in Memphis. So that's the kind of story I heard in '68.
Redemption, Martin Luther King Jr.'s last 31 hours. Did you pursue that line? Do we know, Joseph Rosenbloom, why Memphis?
Yeah. So in my book, I explain how King got trapped in Memphis.
Mm-hmm.
So there was a mayor at the time, Henry Loeb, who took a hard line toward the garbage worker strike. You mentioned garbage workers in your introduction, and there was that bitter strike underway, and the mayor refused to negotiate. He said it was against the law in Tennessee for public employees to strike, and he wouldn't negotiate with lawbreakers. So the strike went on, and that's what brought King to Memphis. And then once he was there, he didn't have any real police protection. I think that's just because the police were indifferent to him. So those are a couple of the ingredients that made Memphis a more likely place than some other cities might have been where King could be in danger.
I think you chronicle that he only had 4 officers as a part of his police detail, and that was only for one day, right? The 3rd.
Yeah, so that's he had really a skimpy protection. The first 2 times he was in Memphis, and on both times he was there to support the strike. The first time was on March the 18th. The second time was March 28th in '68. And on neither of those visits did he have any police security. But when he came back on April the 3rd, this is after there were a lot more threats against him. There had been a riot on March the 28th when he was leading a march. And then there was, as you say, a 4-man security detail assigned to protect him. But it was discontinued at 5 p.m. that afternoon. So the next day, April 4th, there was none. There was no security at all.
In terms of March 28th, we know about what happened there, and like you said, a riot broke out. That kind of you use the word trapped, which is not the first time I've heard that, and I don't disagree. I think that's it's a fairly accurate description. Because of what happened March 28th, even the national media and the national discourse started to question whether or not Dr. King was still relevant, and particularly whether or not nonviolence was still relevant. And so he did get trapped. He felt he had to go back. It was almost the perfect setup. Everybody knew he had no choice but to go back to Memphis.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, his credibility was really under attack. As people were saying that he was no longer in command of his nonviolent movement. He was even being accused of inciting violence. He was under tremendous pressure. And so he felt he had to do something, and what he decided to do was to go back to Memphis and lead a march that he was determined would remain nonviolent. And that, in that sense, he was trapped. He was really kind of forced to return.
Did you find, Joseph Rosenbloom with us, folks, did you find any evidence in your research of any foul play or really a conspiracy, knowing he was coming back? Did you get into that there was a conspiracy to trap him in Memphis and to ultimately kill him there?
I got into the question of conspiracy only at the beginning when I was first thinking about the book and how to structure it and so on. And what I found was that that territory had been so completely mined by various official agencies and by some top-notch investigative authors that I didn't think there was much left for me to do. I didn't want to just repeat what everyone else had said. And also what I read pretty well persuaded me that there was no specific conspiracy that anyone had established. And I think that'll always be true. I think by now some evidence might have emerged, and there is nothing to suggest, for instance, that the Memphis police were part of any conspiracy, even though they disbanded the security after just one day. That kind of thing, I mean, that can feed theories about conspiracy, but I don't think there's anything to it.
Now, you also focus on James Earl Ray. What did you find? What new information did you find out about him?
Well, the new information I found was when you look closely at what he was doing in Memphis, he arrived on the evening of that Wednesday, April 3rd, and then he shoots King at 6:01 p.m. the next day. And if you follow his actions, what you see is this guy who was known as an inept criminal. He really had a history of a pretty bungling attempts at crime. What you see is him sort of groping his way along and having an incredible string of lucky breaks.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, everything had to fall into place for him to be able to shoot King and kill him on that night. And so that's one thing that I document, I think, more thoroughly as a string of lucky breaks than anyone else has done.
So, yeah, I mean, he only had 24 hours to get ready, to prepare.
That's right.
Isn't it also true that Dr. King, either on this trip or the previous trip, was not originally staying at the Lorraine and was criticized for staying somewhere else, I believe a white hotel?
Yeah, so what happened is when he came to Memphis, he didn't come all that often. He was in Memphis when he was passing through or there for a conference or something like that. But when he was in Memphis, he usually stayed at the Lorraine. The Lorraine was the place to stay if you were African American in the Jim Crow era, because the other hotels, the major hotels were still excluded African Americans, and so he would stay in the Lorraine. But he did stay one night after that riot on March the 28th at the Holiday Inn Rivermont, which was a white hotel. By then, by the way, Memphis hotels had been desegregated. But he preferred to stay at the Lorraine. He stayed at the Holiday Inn Rivermont only because once the riot occurred, the police directed him to evacuate the area quickly, and they escorted him to the Holiday Inn Rivermont because the way was blocked back to the Lorraine by the police and the rioting that was underway.
Okay, so that's how he ended up there. But
right.
but I thought I had seen at some point there was some editorials and some articles and some public criticism that pressured him to go and stay later at the Lorraine.
I'm not aware of that. I mean,
okay.
Ralph Abernathy testified to the U.S. House Select Committee on Assassinations that they liked staying at the Lorraine. The people who own the Lorraine really catered to them. They designated this one room, room 306, as King's whenever he wanted it. They wouldn't even charge him for the room. They had room service available to him, to Dr. King, pretty much whenever he wanted it. And the restaurant there served catfish. And Dr. King and Ralph Abernathy were very partial to catfish. So according to Abernathy, they really preferred to stay at the Lorraine, even though by '68 they could have stayed in one of the hotels that had once been segregated.
You focus, Joseph Rosenbloom with us, folks. You focus on the last 31 hours of his life. He arrived in Memphis, I believe you document, on the morning, I think around 10 a.m. or so, on the morning of April 3rd, 10:33 a.m., correct?
That's right. Uh-huh.
And now we know what happened that night, the famous mountaintop speech, Mason Temple, it was pouring down rain in Memphis. And folks, by the way, it's going to be pouring down rain in Memphis while we're there next week. Ironically,
Oh no.
yeah, that's the
I'm
that's the
sorry
weather
about
forecast.
that.
Yeah, I mean everything is coming back together like it did
Yeah,
there.
right. Well, you're going to be able to recreate the scene.
Yeah, yeah, and he didn't feel well, and
No, he didn't. He
and
didn't.
and he didn't really want to go, and he was in his pajamas, and they made him go. But we haven't heard a lot. I want to go to your structure. We haven't heard a lot about what happened after he landed, between the time he landed and the Mason Temple. Can you kind of walk us through that?
I can. So he checks into the Lorraine, and then he goes to a church, Centenary United Methodist Church, to meet with local ministers. He's now organizing the community, the African-American community, to support the march that he's planning for the following Monday. And so that's what he's doing. He's talking to various people, urging them to join with him. He meets with a local Black Power group called the Invaders. He wants to recruit them as parade marshals for that Monday. He's served with an injunction. The city of Memphis had gone to federal court that morning, and they had obtained an injunction and barring Dr. King and several of his aides from marching the following Monday. Mm-hmm. So the federal marshal turns up at the Lorraine when King's back there and serves him with the injunction. He meets with a local lawyer, a well-regarded local lawyer named Lucius Birch, and they begin to plot out how they're going to respond to this injunction. So he's busy with meetings throughout the day. And then, as you said, by the early evening, when this rally is supposed to start at Mason Temple, he's exhausted. He's not feeling well, and he's reluctant to go.
You mentioned too the lucky breaks that James Earl Ray got, and I guess we can infer from that, as just like everything else in life, sometimes it can be right place, right time, or wrong place, wrong time. A few minutes earlier, a few minutes later, a few inches left or a few inches right, it can alter a whole series of events. As that happened for Ray, did you see, when you were looking at this, Joseph Rosenbloom, anything that could have happened with Dr. King in terms of his schedule, anything he could have done a few minutes earlier, a few minutes later, a few inches left or a few inches right, that might have enabled him to have been missed and not, in fact, felled by the assassin's bullet?
There's so many what ifs, Mark. If he hadn't stayed at the Lorraine, which had that exposed balcony and made him so vulnerable to an assassin, if he hadn't just gone up to his room, he was down in another room on the first floor. His room was on the second floor. If he hadn't gone up to his room when he did at about 5:30, so that Ray spotted him and got ready to shoot him, if he hadn't been going out to dinner that night, he was going to the house of a local minister. If he hadn't exited just when he did, when there's still enough light out that someone could see him from across the street, which is where Ray was holed up. If, when he went out of his room, if he hadn't paused at the balcony, as he did in order to talk to some of his aides who were in the parking lot below, if he had just, happened to be scratching his thigh at the moment and had leaned over just before Ray shot, then conceivably the bullet would have missed him, or maybe it wouldn't have struck him as fatally as it did. The bullet struck him in the right side of his face, and so on. So there's so many what ifs, and it's just any one of those could have saved his life.
Yeah. Joseph Rosenbloom, folks, the author of Redemption, Martin Luther King Jr.'s last 31 hours. I couldn't help but notice on the cover, You actually have him in the doorway of room 307. Now that's the adjoining room. He kind of had a double suite, didn't he? The two rooms went together, right?
That's right. They at times they occupied both rooms.
Mm-hmm.
That shot actually was from 1966. He was in Memphis then too, and staying at the Lorraine. But it does show him looking very sort of casual. He usually was when he went out to the public, he was usually dressed in a suit and tie and so on. But you see him it's probably just saying hi to someone or
Right.
ducked out of his room for a minute. It's conceivable in '66 he was staying in room 307.
Yeah. Martin Luther King Jr.'s last 31 hours. Joe Rosenbloom has been our guest. Joe, congratulations on the book, and thank you for sharing with us, okay?
Thank you very much, Mark.
All right, folks, you all check it out. Take care now.
Bye-bye.